when you look at the application security space, one of the things that you need to remember is that developers in general were not taught how to code securely when they learned to code. And so what happens is if a developer joins your organization and they're not taught how to code securely, they start making systemic security mistakes. And the bad boys and girls know that. But the good news is that it's somewhat easy to prevent it, right? The best practice that I've seen is that one of my CISO friends in a large financial services company has a boot camp that everyone is required to go through, and they can't touch anything in any environment until they've been given their seal of approval and really understand good security hygiene. So if you think back somewhere in the neighborhood of when I started working in security, it was probably a couple of years after, like 96, 97, web application firewalls came into play, and then we had application security testing tools that came to market, like the Vericodes of the world. One of the big challenges that organizations have is, what's my cloud estate, right? Most organizations think they have somewhere between 25 and 30 cloud instances, when in fact, it's more like a zero on top of that. And the reason for that is it's really easy to spin up a license of AWS, right? You get on their website, put in your credit card information, and voila, you're up and running. But the challenge is that that can expose you as an organization to bad things. So you really need to understand, what's my cloud universe, and once you understand that, then you can do things to protect the environment. And then we have cloud entitlement management, infrastructure as code, workload protection, and now we're dealing with APIs. So one of the challenges that organizations have, for most of them, think of your organizations, right? How many of you understand, number one, your overall API portfolio? What are you using? What's its security health? And is there a formal process for reviewing API security? I would say that that's probably something you need to pay attention to, because that's ultimately the lifeblood that connects everything when you're using web applications and infrastructure. So, Heraclitus, when he was hanging out in Ephesus along what's now the coast of Turkey, one of the things that he said is the only constant in life is change. I think back when I got into technology back in '84, if I hadn't learned anything between then and now, I'd probably be working at the Geek Squad, which has its merits, except it's a little bit different profile position than I have right now. But historically, when applications were built, you had these 4 basic components, right? And relatively simple environment. Well, fast forward to where we are now, and you have to pay attention to the CI/CD pipeline. And if you look at the top part of this graph, the rectangles on the right-hand side, the orange ones, that's the CI/CD pipeline. And then infrastructure as code beneath that. You have everything from workloads to orchestrators to the cloud network. And one of the things that you need to understand as an organization is, what is AWS or Google Cloud or Azure doing, and what's the gap? So you have to pay attention to all these things. And one of the challenges historically is that you have to use all these different tools, right? I think this is building. Yeah, there you go. So back in my CISO days, one of the things that we did was we proactively managed our security portfolio. We had a buy, hold, sell list, and we had somewhere in the order of 75 tools, something like that. And I don't think that that's changed much in terms of the number of tools you have to use, except you can potentially use that many in protecting the cloud. And for the most part, organizations in the grand scheme of things have looked at best-in-class security tools, which is great, except the more you have, the more complex it is. And how many, just in the application space, we have about that many tools that you need to use. And so what does that mean to you? Well, you have issues in terms of manageability, right? And it's not just being able to manage the environment consistently, but it's the number of people that you have and that you need to manage the environment, which is a really big challenge. I was doing a presentation yesterday, and we were going through the number of open positions that there are right now in the security field. And in the United States right now, there's about 700,000 open positions that can't be filled because there aren't enough people that have the right security skills, and there's about 3 million worldwide that are open. So you have to be thinking in terms of how do I leverage my resources properly? How do I inject the right amount of automation so that I can function as efficiently as possible? And then there's this crazy thing called protecting information consistently. So you can go down the path of using native security tools across all your cloud ecosystems. And most of the vendors have very good tools, whether it's Microsoft or Google, Salesforce. But if you go down the native path, it means you're using a number of tools, which goes back to the manageability issue. And ultimately, it becomes a challenge to protect information consistently, and especially in the application space. So simpler is generally better. This picture actually reminds me of a couple of places. If you ever worked in network infrastructure, there's all these patch panels that you have. And if you don't manage it correctly, you end up with a bowl of spaghetti like this. Being the neat freak that I am, this just really raises the hair on the back of my neck. And so 76 tends to be the average. I was telling you about 75 tools. So one of the things that you need to be thinking about, not just in terms of how do I manage my security portfolio, is how does everything fit together architecturally? So I think of things, I started as a security architect in my first corporate role in security, and one of the things that I think about is, you think in the physical world when you build a structure, one of the first things you do is you engage an architect. And if you skip that step and you go and build the structure, think of the probability of that structure having the right level of integrity. And the more complex the structure, then the more challenging it is to have the right level of integrity. So when you have this environment, not only is it complex, but you have challenges in terms of really understanding what are the issues that I have and how do I triage the issues. And then on top of that, you have, there's a number of different classes of tools, right? You have the DevOps environment where you're using SaaS tools. You have to pay attention to the CI/CD pipeline. In cloud security, you have posture management, workload protection. In the SOC, you have SIEM and SOAR tools. And in terms of application engineering, you have DAS tools and WAF tools. So one of the challenges, by the way, that's the Tower of Babel, by the way, in case that's not familiar to you. So you have all these different tools that don't necessarily speak the same language. So being able to pull all of this information together and rationalize it becomes really challenging. So how do you correlate all this stuff, right? I think the woman that's there, pulling her hair out, I think that's a pretty accurate depiction of what life is when you have all these tools. One of the things that we've done, we did a study in 2002 on cloud security, and what we found, among other things, was that more than 80% of organizations that were successful in their DevSecOps implementation and protecting information in the cloud was that they used 5 or fewer vendors, which makes a lot of sense, right? We've been talking about how do you get this right and how do you create simplicity. And we're dealing with a pretty challenging environment, right? You've got ransomware attacks, you have nation states, and then you have all the geopolitical issues that are happening in the background. So this is effectively a day in the life in how do you leverage the cloud infrastructure from a development environment. So let's say you're developing an application and you click on a bad link. Which is one of the biggest issues that we have, right? Isn't it, social engineering and particularly spear phishing, depending on the profile of people that you're targeting. So someone clicks on a bad link, a file is uploaded to a storage bucket, and oh, by the way, that file happens to contain some malware. So once you go into, once you have the malware in that bucket, then there's an API call that can be made, and then you figure out, all right, so where is everything? And then ultimately, that file can begin to really understand what's the environment, what vulnerabilities are there, execute some code remotely, and Now you have the opportunity for exfiltrating information, stealing, pick your favorite things. And I would tell you a couple of things. One of the things that you need to be paying attention to is this cloud ecosystem from a technical perspective. The bad actors tend to look at things from a very long time horizon. So particularly nation states like the Chinas of the world, they're looking at things not just in years, but in decades. And how do I infiltrate an organization? How do I study what they're doing? And ultimately, how do I take advantage of them? I think the other thing that I would say in addition to that is that there's a lot of organizations that think that the bad actors are much more sophisticated than we are as practitioners, and that's really not the case. The difference is that this is their focus, and they have the time. So for example, in the People's Liberation Army in China, there's about 200,000 people whose focus it is to steal intellectual property from corporations and governments, and that's what they do. And they just need to find one opening where we have to be protecting information consistently, and so that's the challenge that we're dealing with. So things tend to build on any issues that you have. So let's say, for example, an attacker finds a server-side request forgery vulnerability. Well, now they can, if that exists, then they're going to look at the CMDS URL, for example, and with this service, the attacker can extract, what are the session keys that are going on. I'm an encryption bigot, and one of the things that I think is really important is to protect information consistently. There's still this perception in many cases where organizations think that if it's my infrastructure, number one, I'm controlling it and it's safer, and operating in the cloud is not as safe. I always couch that with the fact that every year the FBI informs 3,000 companies that they've been compromised, and it's typically traditional infrastructure. And when you look at the large cloud environments, the Microsofts and Amazons and Googles, Oracles, IBM, they have a lot more resources than a typical organization. But the question becomes, how do you understand what they're doing, and how do you fill that gap, right? And so at any rate, if you go down this path, it's relatively easy for an attacker to go through this thread and ultimately understand what's the contents of that bucket, and ultimately steal the contents. And as everyone knows, information was meant to be liberated. At least that's what the attackers might want you to think. The other thing that you need to understand, both in the cloud and traditional infrastructure, is that I can have a medium security risk, but when you combine that with other risks, it can escalate into having a severe security issue. So think of the different things, just in terms of application development and managing identity. There's all these different things that you need to be paying attention to. And unless you have a properly orchestrated, consolidated, and systemic approach to protecting information, it becomes really challenging. So we've got this elephant in the room, right, in terms of the application ecosystem. And one of the things that most organizations do is they focus on the different aspects and environments that you have. And ultimately, if you do that, it means that you're not looking at things holistically. And if you don't look at things holistically, you're going to run into problems. So, this isn't a 2023 issue. This is something that's existed for some time. But our good friends who created this slide, you've got to make an impact, right? And one of the things that organizations, when you're reviewing your portfolio, one of the most important things to understand is, what's the mix of my tools? What are the tools that I have for protecting and managing traditional infrastructure and testing traditional applications? And then you have to look at what's the tools that I need to protect my cloud environment. And the challenge is that most traditional tools, whether it's application testing or identity or network management, they're designed to protect traditional infrastructure. And you have to understand, number one, what are my requirements in the cloud estate that I have, and how do I use the right tools? I think the other thing that I would add to that is I speak with a lot of organizations, and they tell me that, we just use AWS, or we just use Azure, we just use Google Cloud. And that may be your intent, But ultimately, you need to think about two things. What are the things that I don't know about? And then fast forward to a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, the chances are that you're going to be operating in more environments are pretty high. And so you need to be thinking about that as you're selecting tools, as you establish requirements. So when you compare traditional tools versus cloud native tools, number one, it's going to be hard to make them work in cloud environments, but you have the simplicity in terms of installing the tools. The other thing that they allow you to do is really understand the overall journey from code to cloud. And you can really do much easier analysis when you have a microservice architecture. I would expect that most organizations are using microservice architecture in some aspect. And then you can start doing some modeling. One of the things I remember when Joe was presenting, Joe Sullivan, was you need to be thinking about the fire department analogy, right? Bad things are going to happen. And so I need to be prepared for it. In Joe's case, it was the manifestation of an issue that became really public. And you have to manage perception in the public as well as other stakeholders within your organization, business partners, shareholders, et cetera. So we think about things in terms of how do we make things as simple as possible for organizations. You can have all these different moving parts. I just purchased a house in January, and the woman that lived there, she was there for 40 years, and there were a whole bunch of different plumbing issues, among other things. And they took the approach that, yeah, why really call someone that knows what they're doing when we can take care of it ourselves? And so you have all these bandages, if you will, and duct tape that's being used to fix all these plumbing issues, right? Which works tactically, and in a similar context, when you start taking a consolidated approach and you can do as much as you can with one platform, then that makes life simpler for you. And that's ultimately what we've done. So when I joined Palo Alto about 1.5 years ago, and the reason I did is I'm a big believer in terms of, number one, making things simple. The notion of using a platform. We started Prisma Cloud. We acquired a company called Redlock in 2019 and have built upon that. And we've been very fortunate to identify best of breed companies and integrate them into our platform. So this is all the stuff that I'm telling you that our folks say, yeah, you really need to know about this stuff. It's really groovy. But ultimately, the point that you need to be taking away from this slide is you need to be looking at this as a journey. And there's a lot of organizations that think that I need to protect things in runtime, which is absolutely true. But I need to be thinking back at the start, at the onset of the cloud journey. I'd like to use manufacturing as an analogy. So think of when a car rolls off the assembly line, you don't say, let's add quality now, right? It's a function of the manufacturing process. And if you don't have the right level of quality, you start having defects. And if they're severe enough, you have recalls. And I think recalls are a really good analogy in terms of breaches. They happen, they're expensive, but the big damage is to brand and reputation. We have this title up here, Prevent Risks and Breaches, which is, think of it philosophically, where taking a preventative approach is what you need to do. Because you can't prevent breaches from happening. It's kind of like, think of a general counsel walking into a leadership meeting saying, I can prevent lawsuits from happening. That's just not realistic. But I can create a legal framework that insulates me and helps me minimize the cost of litigation and settlements and everything else. That's the point of this slide, or prevent risks and breaches, is taking a preventative approach and making sure that you embed security throughout the life cycle. So we have this buzzword bingo term right now, right shift left, and which effectively means build quality in from day one. Make sure that you're paying attention to security, that developers understand what their responsibility is, what good security hygiene is, and you need to be testing throughout the life cycle. I think the other thing that's important in this is that you can give developers the right tools, but we in security, we operate as influencers. And so one of the things that you need to do is tell them a good story in terms of why it's important to use them. And one of the things that I like to communicate is, I don't want you as a developer to be the root cause of a breach. I want to make sure that you have the right tools and you understand how to use them. There's a lot of times where even if you deliver that message, that developers go, yeah, what else? I have my code to write. And developers in general are incented for cranking out code. Quality isn't necessarily one of the things they're measured on. So that's one of the things that you need to be thinking about as organizations is, how do I make sure that that's built in to organizational process, that developers really understand that? So think of the tension that exists between security and developers. And one of the things that's really beneficial, which most organizations have opportunities to improve in, is proper governance. So if you as an organization decide that, number one, protecting information is important, and that security is integrated into the development process, and particularly DevOps, when you run into that tension, you can say, look, I want to work with you, but it's my responsibility to make sure that this gets done. And if we can't agree that using security tools is important to you, then it's my responsibility to go up my food chain. It's going to come down your food chain. I don't want to do that. And that's one of the most effective ways to get things done. So you have to protect information, build it in at the source, at the beginning. Then you have to pay attention to what you're doing from an infrastructure perspective, and ultimately protect things in runtime. And likewise, throughout that process, you have to have the right triggers, so when bad things happen, you know about it. Think of having a home alarm system from pick your favorite vendor, and if people aren't paying attention at the command center, translate SIM, source, you're probably not going to be able to address the issues. So having the right alarms in place to make sure that you do in fact understand something happened, what was the issue, how do I deal with it? And ultimately, that's what you have to do holistically. I think this one says, yeah, we're great, and not only do we say it, but look at all these people from GigaOM and Gartner, et cetera, that are saying how good we are. I think the final thing I'd like to leave you with is that, and Joe had mentioned this earlier, is that one of the most important things that will help you be successful through your career is relationships. I'd use one of the extreme examples in my case. I think back to all the positions that I've had since 1986, and every one of them has been because there were a whole bunch of people that are poor judges of character and think I bring something to the table. And so they introduced me to their organization, or there was a recruiter that placed me somewhere in there. And it not only helps you in terms of career progression, but everyone's facing the same issues. And so understanding who do I call, who do I trust, how do I validate that what I'm doing makes sense? And especially during the code to cloud journey and operating in the cloud, it's that much more important to really understand, do I know someone at pick your favorite cloud service provider? Can I call the right people internally? Do I have a good story to tell when bad things happen? Because ultimately, perception is reality, whether it's internally or in the press. Ultimately, you have to go on the assumption that you're going to have to be able to manage the messaging like Joe did when they had their issue at Uber. You can, if you're not properly prepared and you have that 30 seconds when someone in your organization is talking to the media, they're going to get one of two impressions. You're prepared and you're taking care of the issue, or you're not. And I would prefer to be prepared. I'd like them to think that I'm properly prepared. So hopefully this is helpful. Thank you very much. I hope the rest of the day and the week is great for you. Appreciate your time.